Good morning. My name is Lakey, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this MHS Talent Insights webinar series session titled, How Do You Show Up? Emotional Intelligence and Personality for Effective Leadership, presented by Laura Virgilio, the CEO of I Am Branching Out. We are thrilled to have you all here with us today. For those of you joining for the first time, welcome. We would like to begin by telling you a bit about MHS. For over 40 years, MHS has provided trusted data-driven solutions across core disciplines. Our MHS Talent Solutions help to drive success in professional settings. We understand the elements of effective leadership and the requirements for an effective workplace. With our capabilities and tool sets, we help clients identify and cultivate talent. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our presenter. Laura Virgilio is the founder and CEO of I Am Branching Out, a leadership development, coaching, and consulting firm. Laura has over 20 years of experience working with international business leaders, executives, and managers in performance management, leadership development, team development, talent management, and coaching, where she integrates her expertise in various tools, including the EQI 2.0 and the Pearman Personality Indicator. She is certified as a personal and executive coach. She is also a past president of San Diego chapter for Psychological Type, a nonprofit group exploring Jung's work and the MBTI. As we begin our presentation, I again would like to quickly remind you there will be a survey sent to you in order to satisfy PDC requirements. If you do not receive the email before the end of the session, please send us an email at marketing@mhs.com. Okay, over to you, Laura. Let's begin the webinar.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Appreciate it. So today we're going to talk about how do you show up as a leader using emotional intelligence and personality type. Some of you may recognize this individual. This is Dr. Rich Hanley. He runs EQ University. He was the actual individual that certified me in EQ a long time ago. One of the quotes that he gave that really resonated with me as a young leader was that leadership is the art of influence. It's how do you motivate? How do you empower? How do you get people on your side? How do you inspire them towards a vision? So let's talk about what makes a great leader. What does that mean? So what I'd like you to do in the chat box is I want you to think of a leader that inspires you. Think of a leader that you would volunteer to work for or that you really found as a mentor, somebody that really helped you be inspired for a shared vision. Think about those leader characteristics and write down 1 to 3 that you admire the most about this individual that you're thinking of. And I'd like for you to then put them into one of 3 categories. The first category is cognitive skills. This is really about your core skills and thinking ability. It includes things like memory, retention, logic, and the ability to learn new skills. The second category you might put your characteristic in is job specific or technical expertise. This is your ability to perform a task related to the job. So it might be computer programming, Excel, CRM, business acumen, anything like that. And the last, but certainly not the least category is the soft skills or EQ. This is your ability to interact effectively with others and awareness for self. These have things like positive attitude, good communication, and people social skills. So I invite you to go ahead, share your insights, put your answers in the chat box along with maybe why you chose what you did. So again, the characteristic, the category it falls into, and maybe a brief explanation as to why. We'll give you a couple minutes as we start to see people chiming in on what their reasoning is. I see a bunch of people typing. Wonderful. So one of the things that I'm noticing right off the bat is empathy. Absolutely. Caring. Yes, great example. Those both fall under EQ skills. Absolutely. I'm also seeing visionary. Yeah, how do you put a strategy together that people want to follow and that are inspired by? Wonderful. Keep those coming as we move along. What I love about this quote here says business leaders are no longer being defined by their IQs or even their technical skills. It's their emotional intelligence that makes the difference. It is rarely for the lack of smarts or vision. Most unsuccessful leaders stumble because of one simple, fatal shortcoming. The failure is one of emotional strength. Fortune magazine, in 1999, emotional intelligence is not a buzzword. It's been around for decades. So when you think about the interplay between leadership and management, I really enjoy this infographic because it talks a lot about what are those qualities, where do they intersect, but then also what's the difference? As you notice, it says people and leadership and management and things. So what I did is I took this infographic and I started thinking about emotional intelligence subscales that we use with the EQI 2.0 and how do they intersect? You see things like problem solving, empathy, self-actualization, which is about vision and goal setting. How do we relate to and build rapport and trust with others, interpersonal relationships? We see things like reality testing. How grounded are we with the objective reality of what's truly going on, especially when high emotions are involved? We also see emotional self-awareness. If I'm feeling triggered, why? What's going on with that? Flexibility, when we need to pivot, when things change. How many times do we have a vision that halfway through the year we're like, woo, okay, gotta pivot, gotta make some changes. What does that look like? And last but certainly not least is self-regard. As a leader, do I show confidence? So this is the actual definition of emotional intelligence. I'm not going to read it to you, but essentially it's what we call a three-legged stool. You need all three in order for it to stand upright. So the first one, self-awareness. Am I aware of my own emotions? The second one is awareness of others. Do I understand where they're coming from? And the third, which is vitally important, is how do I adapt and flex when maybe those first two aren't in sync with each other or they're not the same? There were a couple studies done, one by Wagner and one by Ruven Baran. The first one looked at IQ prediction of success in the workplace, and the second one looked at EQ prediction of success in the workplace. So if we think about, what do we think is going to be the bigger predictor? Sometimes people think it's IQ. It's only about 6%. If we think about EQ, which is people skills, it's anywhere from 27 to 45. So the way that I relate this is think about a doctor. If you need to go in for some sort of surgery, yeah, you want a doctor that has IQ. You want them to be knowledgeable about what kind of surgery. Maybe that's their specialty. But you also want bedside manner. I want a doctor that will talk to me about reality. Hey, what's truly going on? What do they think? Is this going to help? Is this not going to help? I also want empathy. I want interpersonal relationships. Build rapport with me. Do I trust you? Right? I also want stress tolerance. If something goes in or something goes wrong while you're there, what's the flexibility to pivot and maybe do something different? So when we think about the holistic, bigger picture, we want EQ and IQ, which is essentially what you just told me in the chat box. Most of your answers for a leader that you found was the most inspiring fell into that emotional intelligence and soft skills category. There's a reason for this. So let's talk a little bit about the science behind the EQI 2.0. 30 years of research. It was the first valid and reliable EI psychometric tool. Over 1.5 million people globally have completed the assessment. And there's wonderful checks and balances backed by the psychometric department at MHS that are built into the tool to make sure, are these results accurate? Are they valid? And it's based on, the scores are based on professional norms. So we can use this in the workplace. As I mentioned, Dr. Hanley, when he first taught me EQ, he talked about aerodynamics and EQ because at the time he was teaching emotional intelligence to US fighter pilots in the Air Force. My father was also in the Air Force. This really resonated with me about how in the world do aerodynamics and EQ actually combine and align. So when you think of aerodynamics, there's really only two ways to boost performance. The first one is simply mashing on the pedal. This is increasing the thrust. Not only does this increase performance, you're going faster, but it pulls back and decreases efficiency. You're going to go faster, but you'll burn more as you go. The second way is by decreasing drag. Drag is anything that is weighing us down. This increases performance, but also increases efficiency. And now you're thinking, okay, that's great. How does this relate to EQ? What I always tell my clients is it's overwhelming. You get a report, it's 26 pages, there's 15 subscales, there's 5 composites. Where do I start? What we do is we look at areas of drag. We look at areas that are weighing you back, weighing the individual back, weighing the team back, and say, if I was to balance this more and decrease my drag, how do I get more alignment? How do I get more aerodynamics? So that's how the two things actually work together. So here's the EQI 2.0 model. The first thing I want to mention is the way that the model looks like there's movement. Right off the bat, the first thing I see is a bike tire, right? I see movement. They're not static. There's rotation. It's a holistic approach. So if you think of it as a bike tire, let's think of emotional intelligence as the hub, the middle part, and each one of those 15 subscales is the spokes that come off of it. I use this bike tire model because I've taught this in Europe and Asia. Everybody knows what a bike tire is. So it seems to be internationally works really well. So think about it. You're riding your bike and maybe you hit a big rock and now all of a sudden it breaks or bends that spoke. Because it's counterbalanced with each other, now it's no longer. It's out of balance. It may wobble. It may take a lot more energy because of the way that it's not counterbalanced anymore, or guess what? You might be walking home. So that's how we look at the EQI 2.0 model. You're going to see something on the outer ring, which is at the top that says emotional and social functioning. Emotional and social functioning is what I like to call nature nurture, right? Personality type falls into here, life experiences, culture falls into this. It could be any experiences that you've had with a leader. You know, I'm sure that some of you have like, well, I worked for a micromanager before. Never again will I be a micromanager. So your leadership style is influenced by that emotional and social functioning. The other thing you see on the outer rim is performance. And we chatted about that already with success in the workplace. I call this the chicken or the egg. Because the emotional intelligence model is a snapshot in time, and the shelf life is really only about a year. So if we think about that, we know that we can work on emotional intelligence. We can improve our emotional intelligence. So here's the thing, you know, are we born being really EQ oriented and really smart with people and we learned our job? Or were we really good at our job and we learned EQ? All we know is that they go hand in hand. So that's why I say, is the chicken or the egg? Which one came first? On the outer ring, you're also going to see the well-being indicator. This is how happy and content are you in the moment when you took the assessment. So let's dive a little bit more into the model. The first composite that you see is self-perception. This is about how I, as a person, believe about myself, my inner voice. Am I a good person? Do I know that I have skills that are really well developed, that are strengths in EQ? I'm a really good problem solver. My empathy sometimes can be lacking. I know that about myself. The second one is self-expression. This is, what do I emote? What do people start to see? Am I being open? Am I being honest? Am I being vulnerable? Do I show emotion or am I really stoic? The third one is interpersonal. This is about developing and maintaining social relationships. It's built on vulnerability and trust and rapport, but it's also about getting to know and understanding that maybe one individual needs to be motivated differently than another individual. Knowing those nuances is extremely important. It's also about putting yourself in other people's shoes. If I'm going to make this very large company-wide decision, how is it going to react? How is it going to land on people? Is one group going to love it? One group's going to hate it? How do I take that information when I make decisions? That's when we talk about decision making, right? How do we flex in the moment? What does that look like? How are we on reality testing? Are we taking in data and information to make those decisions? And then the last one is stress management. Last but absolutely not least, this is in the moment. How do we cope with challenges? Resiliency, right? Are we optimistic about the future? What does that look like? Now, I talked about the importance of balance in that hub and spoke model. EQI skills should always be developed in tandem. And when I talk about balance, I literally mean a 10-point difference on any of the subscales. Now, more than 10 point, more out of balance. And higher scores are not always better, especially if there's not balance. So the example I like to give is having a high score of something like 125 in assertiveness, right? Very forthright, very vocal, pretty direct. But if I'm not balanced on empathy, that can be arrogantly uncaring. That can be pushing through even though it's uncomfortable for others, making decisions in a vacuum, not putting myself in their shoes to say, how is this going to land? What does that look like? So now let's move into what we call leadership presence. How do we show up as leaders? Now, I've done a lot of leadership development in my career. I've read a lot of leadership development books in my career. So what I did is I took ideas from different theories and I put them in together and I said, you know what are 3 main attributes of a leader that I could think of? Again, this is just my interpretation, but think about, does this resonate with you? The first one is all about vision. How is my long-term view of the future built with others in mind? Otherwise, it's just a stagnant vision. It's not inclusive. And so what I did is I took 3 subscales that I thought were in alignment with vision, and we're going to go into each one next. The next one is connection. How do we engage and inspire others? As I mentioned, one person might need a little bit different of a motivator than the other. So what does that look like? How do we connect with each individual? How do we connect with our audience, our clients? And then the last one is execution, getting stuff done, having accountability. What does that look like? So let's start with vision. What I'm going to be doing now is we're going to go through each one of these subscales. And I'm going to talk to you about what does that look like? What does it feel like? What might it sound like to you? A couple of things to note for numerics. The average emotional intelligence is 100, right? 90 to 110 is what we call the mid-range. So anything that's 89 or below is what we call low. And then anything that is 110 and above is what we call high. As we just mentioned, high is not always a good thing. And we're going to talk about that. So let's look at each one of these. Let's look first at self-regard. So if we look at those categories of mid to high, self-regard is acceptance of self, confident. I'm aware of my strengths, but I'm also aware of my weaknesses. Low self-regard might be insecure, have lower self-esteem, or maybe lack some confidence. Too much, when it's high and out of balance, might be arrogant or overconfident. Maybe you ignore feedback from other people. I don't need to hear you, I'm good. So think about yourself in this situation. Where would you put yourself in terms of self-regard as a leader? Self-actualization. When we look at self-actualization, that mid to high range is really about goal setting. It's driving for self-improvement. It's being a learner, motivated to be at your best. But it's also about setting goals. What does that vision look like? Low self-actualization might set lower personal goals or not really challenge themselves. Too much self-actualization, I like to call myself a recovering perfectionist, can be things like that. Overly goal-driven, burning out, constantly taking on more work. Optimism. Optimism is all about maintaining a positive attitude during adversity. When things are challenging, are you looking towards the bigger picture and saying, yes, absolutely, we can do this? Are you inspirational? Are you hopeful and confident about that future? Low optimism is fairly obvious, right? Pessimistic, less inspirational, have some uncertainty about the future, maybe some anxiousness around the future. Now, here's the thing. Too much optimism can also really deter trust, because they may be seen as an overly rosy view of the world, or even seen as unrealistic, right? or they may not understand the seriousness of a situation. So if I have an individual coming to me and they're complaining about something and I blow it off as like, oh, it's fine, it's no big deal, it'll take care of itself, and it's a concern for them, I'm not meeting them where they're at, right? And that can erode that trust that we have. All right, let's get into the next one. Connection. How do we actively engage and inspire others? So first, let's talk about interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal relationships is really about making connections with individuals, like feeling at ease in social situations, being vulnerable, trust, right? I trust someone, they trust me. What does that look like? Low interpersonal can be more of a loner, unfriendly or withdrawn, or maybe they're just in their own little bubble, not really caring about making relationships with individuals. Too much interpersonal, this is sometimes where you're like, I really don't want to upset Sarah about her performance review. I'm just not going to tell her. I'm non-confrontational. I'm just going to protect my relationship with her so much. I'm not going to tell her the hard things. It might also be something about unwilling or unable to be alone, gathering and needing people around you 24/7 when it's high and unbalanced. Now let's look at empathy. Empathy is about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, really understanding and anticipating how someone might react. We know the golden rule, do unto others as we would want done unto us. Well, what about the platinum rule? Do unto others how they want done unto them. How do I know? We ask. How can I support you? What do you need from me? I'm here for you. Low empathy might be inattentive to other people's feelings or needs. Maybe you have a difficulty reading individuals. So now let's think about too much empathy. An overuse of empathy might be so concerned about helping everybody else that you actually hinder yourself. The last one says gas mask. You get on a plane. What do they tell you? Put the mask on yourself, then help others. Too much empathy is helping everybody else, and then you have nothing left to give. So think of it from giving from a cup that is empty. How do we replenish this? And then the last of the three main attributes I like to talk about is execution. Let's get stuff done, right? We need to have all three of these attributes in order to be a leader. So the first one we want to talk about is impulse control. What does that look like? It's about being able to be composed, especially in times of high tolerance of frustration, right? When you're really frustrated. Or how do you not just emote, not just say something, right? Your brain goes, ooh, yeah, probably shouldn't say that. Need to wait on that one, being reactive. Low impulse control is that explosive and unpredictable, impatient. Too much impulse control can be analysis paralysis, right? Maybe you're not reacting quick enough. When it goes around decision making, maybe you're not making a decision because you're valuing so much collaboration from other individuals that time goes on and people are like, well, or what are we doing here? Or what are we doing? Are we moving forward? What is this, right? So not moving things forward is also something that people often see with too much impulse control. Stress tolerance. So I will say stress tolerance out of the 15 subscales is the one that if I'm working with a leader or a team that their stress tolerance is low, that's the first place I look. Think about it. You know, not being able to handle stress, you're not your right self. You're not at your best if you're under a lot of duress. So when we think about stress tolerance, we really want to make sure, are you able to cope? Are you stable and relaxed? If you're under a lot of stress and it's low stress tolerance, you may be anxious or distracted. Maybe there's a lot of fear that comes around that. Too much stress tolerance. People always ask, well, why would I not want to have really high stress tolerance? Why would I not want to be this, Jedi that has like 130 in stress tolerance? Why would I not want to be that? Well, sometimes that leads to being a burnout and doing too much work if you're constantly taking on other people's work. I've also seen it where an individual was so cool, calm, and collected, high stress tolerance, not a lot of emotional expression, came across very stoic And in a time of crisis, the team actually lost trust because they said, wow, she doesn't seem to be reacting to the seriousness of this situation. Interesting. I wonder why. There's a distrust that can sometimes happen. Now let's talk a little bit about happiness. This is that well-being indicator that we talked about. It focuses on 4 subscales that are aligned with the well-being indicator. They include self-regard, optimism, interpersonal relationships, and self-actualization. Happiness does not, the numbers do not actually go into your overall EI score. They are separate questions that are asked that just showcase where are you in your well-being? How happy and content are you in the moment when you took the assessment? Again, this can change with time. All right, let's talk about leadership potential. When we think about all the different theories around leadership that are out there, the one that MHS chose to look at when talking about leadership potential with their research is they chose transformational leadership. And what they did is they took each one of these 4 pillars and said, how do each one relate to the subscales? So the first one they chose was insight, and they used it around inspirational motivation. How do you provide insight by sharing a purpose and a hopeful vision for colleagues to follow? How do we inspire people to exceed these goals? The next one they looked at was authenticity. How do we as leaders show up specifically as a role model? Am I telling you one thing and doing something else? What does that look like? What about transparency? The next one is innovation. How do I take risks? Do I want to hear new innovative ideas or do I stifle them? Yeah, you got a better way to do this? Let's hear it. What other ways could we do it? Are there 2 right answers? What does that look like? And the last one is coaching. As a leader, one of our roles is to be a coach, to mentor, to work with those employees, work with those teams, nurture them. I want them to be at their highest level of performance. I want them to be firing on all cylinders. So how do I do that? How do I do that for each individual? So that's that individualized consideration. So here's a quick overview of how those competencies and pillars we talk about with leadership potential, along with those subscales that fall underneath them. First thing I notice, self-actualizations in all 4. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what's the top? What's the apex? Self-actualization, goal setting, right? What does that look like? Inspiration. In the EQI 2.0 leadership report, we actually have a way to look at those 4 categories along with their subscales to say, where are you a fantastic leader? What could you work on? Where can we develop? We also have pages for each one that says, here's your self-regard score for each of the subscales. Here's your self-regard score. Here's how it impacts your leadership potential. And here's strategies for action. And at the bottom where it says balancing your EI, this is where we look at when something's too high and it's not balanced with something that's too low, where might there be an issue? When I work with leaders, we look at trends. Is there a certain subscale that keeps coming up? That's the drag. That's the 1 to 3 areas that I could have them focus on that would make them more aerodynamic and perform better and be more efficient over time. Now, let's talk about how does personality type actually paint a more vivid picture of how we show up. The first thing we look at, going back to Jungian psychology, is really about attitude of energy. So we have energy around extroversion and energy around introversion. One thing that Jung mentioned is that you have both. It's just one's easier than the other. So one is in the conscious and one is in the subconscious. So when we look at extroversion, this is about external experiences, preferring action, right? Focusing on people and things, really loves working with groups, being extroverted. Then you have the side of introversion, which is about more directing energy inward, thoughts, perceptions, reflection, So now let's look at the Pearman Personality Integrator, which is based on Jungian's 8 mental cognitive functions. So with the Pearman Personality Integrator, we're looking at two things. We're looking at how easy and natural is it for you to do something, but we're also looking at how often do you get to demonstrate it? How often do you actually get to do it? So let's say, for example, you're a very extroverted individual. You really like working with individuals. You like to focus on people and things. You prefer action. You get excited by distractions. But maybe you don't get to demonstrate a lot of that. The example I like to give for myself is COVID. I'm a very clear extrovert. When COVID hit and I wasn't really had the ability to work with other individuals and go into a coffee shop and work on PowerPoint just to get their energy, I was very extroverted naturally, but I wasn't demonstrating extroversion. And it was a stressor for me. Now, introversion is very much about going inward, directing your energy inward, ideas and thoughts and perceptions, really doing a lot of reflection. Sometimes guarding thoughts until they're almost perfect, golden nugget, right? I got something to say, just wish those extroverts would maybe stop talking so I could actually interject. The next one is about taking in information. It's about sensing and intuition. The sensing function is around details, tangible objects, dealing with the task at hand, focusing on concrete information, data, facts, details. Intuition is looking at possibilities, ideas, big picture, strategy, what could be. Also looking at associations and meanings and connection. And the last one is decision making, really looking at thinking and feeling. Feeling is about making decisions around personal values and ideals, whether it's you or the group. Having an interest in people, really thinking about how is this decision going to impact others, desiring harmony, warmth, and sympathy. The thinking side is making decisions on critiques, analyzing outcomes, cause and effect. If this happens and this happens, this is the answer. Very logical, oftentimes using impersonal criteria. So when we look at the Pearman Personality Integrator model, it's a quick build, but it really looks at extroversion and introversion as that attitude of energy. Then it looks at the pieces on the perceiving function. How do we take in and gather information? It also looks at the judging functions around making decisions using thinking and feeling. What it does with the 8 mental function model is it takes it one step further and says, you know what, how are extroverted attitudes of energy around taking in information and making decisions? And it also looks at internal energy around taking in information, processing information internally, and then making those decisions. What does that look like? We're going to go through now the 8 cognitive functions to give you an overview of them. Some of you are probably very familiar with them, and some of you maybe this is the first time you're actually seeing them. It's very different from the MBTI in that it looks at those 8 mental functions. So let's go through them. The first one is all around extroverted sensing. This is around experiencing through the 5 senses, concrete, tangible data, the here and now. I like to use the picture of a juggler because at any given time, you have to know where everything is, right? Am I throwing a sword? I don't want to hit the pointy end, right? What does that look like? When we think about communication and we think about influencing others, it's really about, you might hear someone say, I tell it as I see it. Remember as a kid, the I Spy game? We used to travel all the time and go camping throughout the US. We love national parks, and I've probably been to the majority of them. We always played I Spy, right? I spy something yellow. That's extroverted sensing. Everybody looks around, what's yellow? Okay. The next one is introverted sensing. This is about recalling stored information, right? This is slow and methodical because you're going into your brain. Think of a filing cabinet, or what I love is a USB. How is it stored? How do I bring out that information of maybe how I've done it before? So you might hear somebody say, this reminds me of when. Looking at those past experiences. How can I potentially use what we've done before in today's situation? I always tell people that introverted sensing might be a scent, right? Anytime I smell gardenia, that reminds me of my grandmother. That was the perfume she wore. Wherever I am, that's introverted sensing, recalling those experiences of my childhood with a scent. Okay. So now let's get into the intuition side of things and look at extroverted intuition. It's all about being aware of what could be, possibilities, patterns, connections, excited by things that are new, excited by change. So I like to think of it as fireworks. They're going everywhere. You don't know what they're going to be. You don't know what color. Is it going to be the American flag? Is it going to be a rose? I don't know, right? What's popping up? What you might hear when communicating with an extroverted intuition individual is, we could do this, or this, or this, or this, having a lot of ideas around that. So think about when you're trying to influence someone with extroverted intuition, they might need to go through a variety of different ideas before they can actually focus on one. They want to share. So introverted intuition, this is about vision. This is about potential, about what could be, excited by the unknown, not defined by what we've done in the past, not defined by what's in the present or the future. They read between the lines a lot and find symbols, meanings, rather than concrete information. So when you're influencing or communicating with an introverted intuition individual, they might ask things like, what does this mean? They like to go really deep. Oftentimes have that golden nugget that they want to share. Sometimes, and I really want to have this as a watch out, is sometimes as they're synthesizing that information, they seem disengaged. How many times have you been in a team meeting where you think, oh, wow, that person is not engaged. They're not interested in this. They haven't said anything. They look like they're off in la la land. They might actually be processing everything internally, right? So we need to allow them the opportunity to say, hey, I invite you to share. You look like you're in deep thought, John. Tell me about that. What are you thinking? What are your ideas? Now let's look about the decision-making functions, extroverted thinking. This is about systematizing. I always light up with this one because I love Sudoku. This is actually one of my dominant functions, is I love scoping out problems. How does this fit with the rules? What about the policies that we have? Is this straightforward? Is it linear? I love it. Logic. Yes, absolutely. Sudoku. Everything has one line where it's at in one box and one number. I love it. Some people are like, oh, that's terrible. I hate it. That sounds just deplorable. Probably not extroverted thinking. So when we think about how are we communicating and influencing someone that has an extroverted thinking style, you need to give logical order. I love an agenda. I also love to go line by line through the agenda, right? Like that's my happy place. So think about that. They like that cause and effect approach, especially in presentation style. I know that about me, but I also know that not everybody is the same type as me or has the same dominant functions as me. So I oftentimes need to give space for new ideas and innovation. So you might hear things with extroverted thinking was, how is the data analyzed? I want specifics. Introverted thinking. This is an inner subjective framework. This is all about precision, rephrase, restate, reclassify, really making sure that these logical ideas and concepts make sense. They love to play devil's advocate. So if there's someone you're working with on your team or you're communicating with and they seem to always ask the hard questions, it's because their precision is really important to them. It's a value of theirs. They may say something like, your approach only works in ... because they've already thought of everything else. And literally, this is the only way it works. Again, they're not doing it to be mean. They're not doing it to throw it off. That's how their brain works. That's how they're wired. So let's get into the decision-making functions around feeling. The first one is extroverted feeling. It's about harmony. This is about what their values are around interpersonal. caring for others, reading others, potential with others. You often hear them say, I really value what you bring to the group. They're the cheerleader, they're the rah-rah, thank you so much, appreciate you, great ideas. They're very much getting everybody harmony oriented, everybody excited about a decision or a vision or a strategy. Introverted feeling. This is about valuing. So again, it's values. It's not about values of the collective. It's more about internal values. That's why I like the tuning fork or the nervous system. What resonates with me as an individual? When I'm making decisions, my own beliefs are very much coming into play. Sometimes they come across as very rigid, because if you violate their basic core, not going to happen. They're going to be very outspoken about it, or they're not going to resonate with that vision if it's against their basic core values. You might hear them say, ugh, this doesn't feel right for me. Or you might hear them say, oh my gosh, I love your vision. It absolutely feels right. It resonates with me. So now let's talk about, how does the EQI 2.0 and the Pearman actually integrate together? In my career, I've spent my time looking at leadership development around emotional intelligence and around the MBTI and Jung's 8 mental function model. What I love about these two is they actually come together with research to show, as an extrovert, how might you be with impulse control? As an intuitor, how are you on reality testing? How are you on optimism? So these two reports actually pull that information together and give your client or your team a deeper view of where are they really good and where are their areas for development. If we have all ENFs in a room, they're going to make decisions and they're going to look at a problem and solve that problem in a very similar way. How do we make sure that maybe the IST audience feels heard? What vision resonates with them? They may show up very different. In the report, we actually see, how do each of these EI skills relate to certain types? Whether it's low on impulse control, average on impulse control, or high on impulse control. So what I love about these two tools is it shows the research. It shows how they integrate together to build a very broad stroke of, what are we working with? When I work with teams, I like to bring the two tools together. When I work with individuals with coaching, I like to bring the two tools together. It helps me understand, what is the team I'm working with, but it also helps me understand, how do I need to change my style to work better with that team or that individual? I know this was a lot of information, and I would love to hear from you all. What are the key takeaways that you got from what you learned about today as how you as a leader show up? Are you lacking in a certain area, or do you have an overuse of a certain area? What about your mental functions? How is my extroverted thinking maybe rubs some people with introverted feeling the wrong way because I'm pressing for a decision? So let's talk about that. Pull up the chat box. I'd love to hear, what are some key takeaways that you learned from today's discussion about you as an individual and how you show up as a leader? Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate the energy, the enthusiasm, the engagement in the chat. I know these webinars are hard, so I really enjoyed that. You helped me carry along. Here's the thing, I want to have more conversations with you. You can reach me on my email address. You can go onto my website. You can see some sample reports of both of these assessments. But I really would love to connect with you, whether it's on LinkedIn or via email if you have questions or comments. We are going to pull 2 names for raffle prizes, and those individuals get to choose. Do you want to take the EQI 2.0 assessment and get a debrief with me? Or do you want to do the Pearman and get a debrief by me? So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over now to Lakey and the rest of the MHS team with some closing comments and picking out those winners. Thank you so much for your time.
We'll now move on to questions for our presenter. Thank you again so much, Laura, for a very engaging session today. I'm going to start off with the first question. Who is your primary audience when using these tools?
Well, that's a great question. So want to reiterate that there are two different types of reports that you can run for both the EQI 2.0 and the Pearman. One is the leadership report and one is the workplace report. So the workplace report is more around individual contributors. It has language that also associates with that. And the norm group for that is much, much larger because of it's with anyone that could take it. I use this a lot with sales teams or people that maybe are matrixed in an organization but don't necessarily have direct reports. There's also a leadership report, and the leadership report shows those leadership potential pillars that we talked about earlier. And I use that with anybody that has any sort of direct reports or any sort of leadership authority. Also, I use the leadership report with individuals that maybe have high potential and they want to be compared to a norm group that is with others that have direct reports, but are also very successful in organizations as a leader and also have those potential competencies that we're looking at. So both of them can be used. It really just depends on your audience. Great question.
Great. Thank you, Laura. The next question, do you need to be certified in the EQI 2.0 and or Pearman to use the assessments?
Yes, that's another great question. Absolutely. So MHS does do certifications. We have master trainers like myself and others in the US and abroad that actually certify individuals or organizations, whether you're an internal consultant or you're an external consultant, in these tools. So it's essentially a 2-day workshop that you attend along with some pre-work and then an assessment exam at the end. And then once you become certified, you're able to run these tools and use them however you want. You can coach towards them and whatnot. So if you are interested in getting certified or have any more questions about that, feel free to email me or go to my website and you can learn some more.
I do see some more questions coming in here. I'm not clear on the difference between MBTI and Pearman. Can you further clarify?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I get that all the time. So the Pearman Personality Integrator looks more at the 8 mental functions from Jungian psychology, whereas the MBTI, as you know, was created by Isabella Myers and Catherine Briggs as part of Jung's work that he did. So the MBTI looks at what we call preference pairs or a dichotomy of extroversion or introversion. And the Pearman actually says you have both of those. Just one is more readily accessible than the other. You have a dominant preference for that, right? So if you look at the MBTI step 2, you'll get more into those 8 mental functions. So the Pearman looks at the ability and demonstrated on how do you use the mental functions, but it also looks at how natural and how easy is it for you. So sometimes those are the same. So as I mentioned with extroverted thinking as being one of my stronger, more clear, dominant functions, I readily use extroverted thinking. It comes up easy for me. Excuse me. I readily, easily call up extroverted thinking. But sometimes when I'm in an innovation or brainstorming workshop, that's difficult for me to do. So sometimes there is a stress between the two. So we're looking at what's natural and what's demonstrated. When there's alignment, then there's probably not a stressor. When there's a misalignment, that's when we talk about what's going on. Is there something that you have a preference for, but you don't get to use? So that's how those two are very different. The Pearman Personality Indicator also has what we call the Flex Index, and we just didn't have enough time to dive really deep into what the Flex Index is, but essentially it's looking at resiliency and adaptability in times of change. So it also looks at how do we rejuvenate? How open are we to new ideas? How do we connect with other individuals as well?
Thank you, Laura. I have one last question for you. This attendee is asking, they're certified in the EQI. Do they also need to be certified in the Pearman?
Yes. So if you're certified in the EQI, fantastic. That's great. You would use the same portal when you become certified with the Pearman in order to run those reports. But yes, it is a very similar certification process, but you do need to be certified in the Pearman in order to use that tool.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. So on that note, we are at the end of our webinar, and I wish you all a great day.
Thank you.